looking at the way he works in terms of short fiction, for example, everything he seemed to talk about really resonated with me as a sort of a young, agonisingly self-conscious writer, I suppose, because he is not that. He's such a kind of breath of fresh air, such a drink of cold water, I suppose, in those letters when he talks about, you know, don't worry about all this stuff, just get on with trying to see what's there and trying to tell the truth as best you can. And so reading him as a younger writer was really interesting, because my initial response was one of sort of bewilderment, and that continued for a long time. I'm thinking, why is this a story? Why is he telling us this? How does that make a story? Why has he picked that as such? It didn't seem to agree with any of the kind of templates or formulas that my writing tutors were talking about. Nothing seemed to happen. Nobody seemed to change. There was no epiphany. There was no shift. What's going on, you know? So there was all that kind of, why is it so arresting, this stuff? And I was having a talk with another short story author from Tassie a few days ago, and we're talking about that word, arresting. And she said it's not that you want to stop action or narrative, it's that in a short story you want to stop the reader in their tracks. You want to arrest them and stop them, make them look again.
But I wanted to say, Chekhov, you know, I'm from Moscow, not from Taganrog, where Chekhov was born, but it's not that far. Anyway, and...
You're a Christian think partner,
I hope you'll agree with me. I think, well, I come from a country which operates very well. We operate well as a choir. As a solo singers, we're shit. You know? And everything we've achieved, if we've achieved anything, that was done as a collective effort. You know what I mean? A solo individual person was, you know, it doesn't matter. Someone else will replace him. Well, no one can replace Chekhov. And as a younger student in Moscow, of course, I was, you know, in opposition to the regime. We were all revolutionaries and all that. And Chekhov, to me, symbolizes this kind of solo singer. He was the one who had the talent, the inner tuning, if you will, talent to step outside the mass and sing his own beautiful song.
I first discovered Chekhov. Well, I won't mention the little contact I had when I was 15 in my drama course in France, but I will quickly. I was requested to rehearse, to practice the scene of the large scene in The Proposal, one of his short plays. I was playing Ivan Vasilievich Lomov. And this was one of my first scenes, really. I was 15, very nervous and shaking, and I thought I was terrible at it. But I got the best compliments from the director after the rehearsal, and I realized that I made people laugh, you know, and it's something which surprised me a little bit, because I had, from what I've heard of Chekhov, from what I've seen of Chekhov, the productions were always dark and gloomy and sad and tragic. And much later on, when I was requested to do the seagull for the Sydney Theatre Company, I looked at the text and not at the tradition. I looked at Chekhov, what he had to say, and not what Stanislavski, the first director of Chekhov, had to say. And in doing so, coming back to the root, coming back to the humanity, coming back to the life, we found a different world. And the year after, then I decided to do the three other plays at Anthill, and continuing on the same wavelengths of discovering and enhancing the humor, which was, in my opinion, jumping off the page.
Because what struck me first was that clinical detachment. You talk about Chekhov's compassion, but he's a terribly dark and cruel writer as well. And he often said, if we show the people of Russia what they're like, then maybe they'll change. And so I found that quite astonishing. But I'll tell an anecdote. I'll tell a short, very, very short story. My first meeting with Chekhov. Of course, you know the name. It's part of the cultural wallpaper when you're growing up, even though you haven't read someone. But this was a ward round when I was doing a paediatric rotation, and I was wandering around with a white smock, and they had we used to have these pockets in the front of the smock where your tools were supposed to go. your doctor tools. And I had a copy of a Polish poet in there. And I'd made a mistake on the ward round. And in those days, medical education was through public humiliation. And it was called, it's called thalamic learning. You never forget when you've been shamed. And so I'd given the correct this incorrect answer. And the consultant, his name was Sims, and a wonderful teacher and very erudite. Before he got to the thalamic learning, he said, "What's that book there?" And produced the book. And then he said, tell us about it. And I said a few words. And then he said, "Who do you think you are, Anton Chekhov? If you ever make that mistake again, even if you get a distinction in every other answer in your exam, I will fail you." And I didn't ever forget that thalamic lesson. But I went straight home and looked up Anton Chekhov and the Great Lives. And I realised, yes, because up to that point I didn't really know who I was. Yes, I'm Anton Chekhov. Yeah. For a while. As one does, you learn often by imitation or what have you, plagiarism.
This is from the Cherry Orchard. That's the Petya Trofimov, the student, the kind of idealist, and again, who talks a lot, but nothing really happens in the end.
Something for you first, Owens.
You must be kidding me.
No. That's from me to you.
That's theater for you. Here we go. Here we go. I should charge $1 million for it.
This is thalamic learning, public humiliation.
But Steve, do you want to know? Because I don't know. Did I give enough to our beloved listeners?
Perhaps a little bit of an introduction.
Yeah. Well, that's from the Cherry Orchard. There's a character Petya Trofimov who is a student, kind of idealist who constantly bugs everybody with beautiful ideas, but of course,
a bit lofty.
That's the word. Yeah. Well, here it is, just for musicality of Russian language. 20 seconds. Человечество идет вперед, совершенствуя свои силы. Все, что недосягаемо для него, теперь когда-нибудь станет близким, понятным. Только вот надо работать, помогать всеми силами тем, кто ищет истину. У нас в России работают пока очень немногие. Громадное большинство той интеллигенции, какую я знаю, ничего не ищет, ничего не делает и к труду пока не способна. Называют тебя интеллигенцией, а прислуги говорят «ты». С мужиками обращаются как с животными, учатся плохо, серьезно ничего не читают, ровно ничего не делают, о науках только говорят, в искусстве понимают мало. Все серьезно, у всех строгие лица, все говорят только о важном, философствуют, а между тем у всех на глазах рабочие едят отвратительно, спят без подушек, по 30, по 40 в одной комнате, везде клопы, смрад, сырость, нравственная нечистота. That'll do. It's Anton Pavlovich, Anton Pavlovich.
I'm always compelled to believe that the English hate us by what they do to Chekhov. And I've watched so many BBC versions of Chekhov plays, and I can't help but find them slow torture. And yet, because I've never read Chekhov in the Russian, I know that there's a gap there somewhere, and I sense it, and I feel it, and I know it. But I just wonder, because you have read and know it so intimately in the Russian and have read the English, what is it like for you to work in translation? And what are the touchstones for it being so wrong?
I think I understand your question. It's kind of true. I mean, I've been involved in a number of productions of Chekhov in the English-speaking world. Not so much in Russia, though. Anyway, I was fairly young when I left. But I agree with you. In a lot of Chekhov productions, Westerners seem to lose this wonderful humor. And a lot of productions, strangely enough, despite the fact that he is such a humanist, and all his plays are about human kidneys and heart and lungs, you travel within the, there's not a dollop of kind of ethnography in Chekhov, you know? It's not about how long was the beard of the Russian peasant in 1865, you know what I mean? How red were their shirts, how big was the samovar or anything like that. There's not a dollop of that. And in the West, quite often, the productions bog down in that desire to reproduce pictures of kind of Russian life. But that is not Chekhov at all. And I think that a lot of troubles stem from that fact. That's why for me as an actor, and I'm bowing low to Jean-Pierre Mignon, and I was involved in his productions of Chekhov plays at Anhill Theatre, because Jean-Pierre's vision, there was not an iota to step into that kind of ethnographical truth. And that was so arresting, is that the word? Fresh, wonderfully human, and so interesting for us actors to be involved in that, rather than kind of doing some kind of, yeah, I'm doing a Russian thing. You know, you cannot play an Australian, Russian, Chinese, American, you know, you play a wounded Russian, a wounded Australian, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
but
right.
if there is no wound, then there's nothing to play. And I think, well, with Jean-Pierre and with Chekhov, they go for the wound, not for, you know, how long is the bandage you put on the wound.
Yes.
Please.
Chekhov, I've always assumed that one of the reasons Chekhov has a great international reputation is because he's easily translatable, in the sense that his prose is ordinary. It's not. There's no style there. It's about people and character and stories and wounds. Those things translate. They're universal stories. Perhaps that's what you're saying.
Absolutely.
And I just. So this is just not knowing Russian, but knowing what a lot of people like Nabokov who prized Chekhov, but regarded his prose as dull, but prized him for those other things we're talking about. And those sort of writers often do translate very well. Those that don't depend on the music, in the short stories I'm talking about, leaving aside dialogue, but the short stories are largely dialogue. So it's interesting to hear what you're saying about that.
But well, you're always emotionally exhausted at the end of a Chekhov play. It's not like nothing's happened.
You'd be emotionally exhausted after a 5-page story. Like in Utah, my favourite Chekhov story, I think, of all, and it's a very short and an earlier one. And there's a young, impoverished seamstress lives with a medical student in the big house, looks after him in the usual ways, helped him through medical school. She serves as his anatomical skeleton. She's so thin, and is also an artist model. And you know, he's going to pass her on to the next medical student, and he's going to go on to a better life. And there's no moralising, as you say, Stephen. There's no editorialising. Simple, clear dialogue, and it stabs you through the heart. And the cycle goes on. You know that. It's and okay,
Just breaks your heart, doesn't it?